In April 1997, in Stockport, Greater Manchester, a 17-year-old girl was abducted at knife point by a stranger. She was held hostage for over 11 hours.
I started to beg him. I didn't show any emotion before, and I was pleading with him not to hurt me.
Unbeknown to his victim, hours before her abduction, the stranger had brutally murdered another innocent woman in a gruesome act of violence.
I've never, ever experienced something as horrific as the circumstances surrounding that case.
The mysterious killer was 27-year-old Nicholas Burton, who did everything he could to prevent being brought to justice.
You've still got no sense of any motive, no reason why has this happened.
Psychiatrists agreed that Burton was one of the most unstable people they'd ever assessed.
This is something that is part of who this man is, and he's going to continue to be a danger.
Nicholas Burton had been exposed as one of Britain's most evil killers. In the early hours of April the 27th, 1997, armed police gathered together, ready to storm a hotel room in North Wales. They were trying to locate a dangerous predator who'd abducted a 17-year-old girl at knife point.
When North Wales Police went to arrest Burton, it was for the abduction of Debbie. It was only when they got there and found his room that they realised they were actually arresting a murderer.
As officers searched the hotel room, they discovered evidence that linked their suspect to the cold-blooded and savage murder of 27-year-old assistant bank manager Rachel McGrath the previous day.
In the hotel room, they found Burton's clothing, which was stained in my sister's blood, a black leather jacket, trousers, shoes, and actually the murder weapon, a hunting knife, which is about 24 centimetres long.
This killer's story begins on the edge of the Peak District in the northwest of England. Nicholas Burton was born on the 5th of February, 1970.
He was born and bred in Derbyshire, in New Mills, that sort of area, in a little tiny part of it called Newtown. His parents were lovely.
He was described by his mother at the time as happy-go-lucky.
Nicholas Burton appeared to have quite a normal childhood, and in his early adulthood he was a full-time worker in a factory where his father had been for 30 years.
He'd been educated well, he'd got a steady job, and everything was all going well.
As an adult, Burton began a relationship with a woman who was a singer. She claimed he was a fairly normal guy when they were together.
He was okay, Mr. Joe Public, average sort of person, really.
The relationship fell apart when his girlfriend got a singing job in another part of the country and moved away.
He seemed to take that really badly, that he couldn't deal with that rejection, and he seemed at that point then to spiral, and things changed quite dramatically.
Nicholas Burton started experimenting with alcohol and drugs.
It started off with the usual cannabis and built up very quickly to LSD, acid.
When the substance abuse was gathering pace, he just seemed to go to a downward spiral, that he was worse and worse.
The harder substances were having an effect on Burton, and the change in his behaviour was apparent to those around him.
And at one point, his mum in particular was worried that he'd overstepped the mark with his mental health, and she became concerned. One day she came back from work and she discovered in the bathroom was a lot of towels that were covered in blood, and he'd locked himself away in the bedroom. She thought it was very strange, and she suspected, and even though this has never been confirmed, that he'd castrated himself.
that kind of mutilation suggests some kind of self-hatred directed very, very specifically at a certain part of the self, which might include his sexuality and masculinity.
What amazes me is that he's gone from the very low level, just the average Joe public, and escalated very, very quickly into a monster and the way he was.
In 1997, 27-year-old Burton was still living in New Mills, Derbyshire. 14 miles away, in Greater Manchester, 17-year-old Debbie had just recently passed her driving test. 25 years on, Debbie now wishes to remain anonymous. Her words have been voiced by an actor.
I was living with my parents and my two sisters in Gatley in Stockport. It was quite a nice community. It was nice pubs, we knew the neighbours, we all knew each other. It was quite normal and safe.
On Saturday, the 26th of April 1997, Debbie's day had started in the usual way.
She was en route that particular morning, on the Saturday morning, to go to a part-time job.
Debbie stopped at her local convenience store on her way to work to get some crisps and a drink. She parked her car directly outside the shop.
I was literally around the corner from my house. On the way to the shop, I noticed a man walking the opposite way, but I didn't think anything of it.
When Debbie came back out of the shop, she noticed the same man had doubled back and was lingering nearby.
I remember thinking, I've just seen you walk past. Why are you here? What do you want?
And as she went back to her vehicle, he jumped out on her and threatened her with a knife.
And he just approached me with a knife. And he said, can you get in your car and give me all your money, please? I was trapped. There's nowhere to run. If I could run, he'd run after me, and I felt I wanted to scream. I did as I was told and got in the driver's seat, and he climbed at the back of me and climbed into the passenger seat. So he's sitting next to me with a knife to my thigh while I was driving.
Well, the poor girl, is obviously terrified out of her wits. He's still threatening her with a knife and orders her to drive, not round the block, but a long way.
The knife-wielding carjacker ordered Debbie to drive him to Wales, claiming he'd never been there before and wanted to go. Debbie had only recently passed her driving test and was fairly new to the roads.
I'm trying to concentrate not to crash the car. I've never been on a motorway. There's nothing I could do. People are driving past me and I'm trying to get their attention. How can you get their attention? They're too fast. He'll see my reaction. I'm trapped. There's nothing I can do. I can't do anything.
Debbie was terrified. The 17-year-old was being held hostage in her own vehicle by a complete stranger, with no way of escape. As they headed into the remote countryside of Wales, the petrified teenager had no idea what the deadly stranger had planned for her. But one thing was for sure, Debbie's life was in grave danger. In the spring of 1997, 27-year-old loner and drug abuser Nicholas Burton was living in the small town of New Mills in Derbyshire. On the 26th of April, just 14 miles away in Stockport, Greater Manchester, 17-year-old Debbie had been on her way to work when she was abducted at knife point and ordered to take the motorway, heading west.
On the way to Wales, I was doing about 60 on the inside lane. And I was running out of petrol. So I said, we need to get petrol. He said, turn off here. There's a church, a dirt track. He ordered me to reverse near the graves. When I reversed in near the church, and then he told me to get out.
She will know that things are getting more and more isolated. She knows there's this guy in the car with a knife. I can't imagine what she was thinking, where this was going to end.
The abductor ordered Debbie to get into the boot of her own car so that she'd be hidden away when he went to refuel it.
He opened the boot. He told me to lie on my front, put my legs up, put my hands behind my back.
She was forced into going into the boot of the car. He was clearly angry, and he was taking it out on Debbie. She was petrified, as you can imagine.
I started to beg him. I didn't show any emotion before, and I was pleading with him to not hurt me.
He cut the seatbelt webbing, tied her up and gagged her.
He tied my arms and my legs together with seatbelts. He put one around my mouth and then shut the boot.
With Debbie in the boot, her abductor drove her car to a nearby petrol station, filling it up with £10 that Debbie had given him earlier. He then drove around for another 45 minutes or so, with Debbie still in the boot.
I was helpless, just thinking of my friends and my family. They're going to be worried where I am. I can't die like this. I won't. I can't. This can't be it.
I can't even begin to think how utterly horrified, terrified she must have been.
Eventually, the man stopped the car and released Debbie from the boot.
He got me out of the boot and we parked in the mountains on the side of the road. I stayed there for hours. There was no one around. He was talking absolute rubbish about drugs, about the Happy Mondays, what the songs mean to him. He's smoking cigars.
And all the time, she's trying to involve him in conversation in a desperate attempt to save her life.
I remember telling him that I was 18 in 4 weeks because I wanted him to like me. Surely, if he liked me, he's not going to hurt me.
She had the presence of mind, or maybe that survival instinct where she tried to build some kind of rapport with him. That's an incredibly difficult thing to do and took great presence of mind and bravery from her.
A rare glimmer of hope emerged as another car went by.
But he was watching my reactions the whole time. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't scream for help again because he'll use the knife.
Hours went by and eventually Debbie's abductor decided it was time to move on. They were low on fuel again and this time out of cash.
I said, I've got my bank card. I can get cash. I can get more cash. He said, okay, we'll go and get cash. And I need more petrol.
The knife-wielding man and Debbie drove down to the Welsh coastal town of Carnarvon.
He then unleashed Debbie and she went with him to the cash point to put the number in. And he then tried to get some money.
There were loads of people around. He's got his arm around me with a knife to my stomach. There's people laughing, walking past me. Couldn't do it. Couldn't do it again. I couldn't help. I wanted to say help. I just couldn't do it.
She must have been terrified. What an ordeal to take place.
Debbie had missed her opportunity to escape and was still at her abductor's mercy. He got Debbie back into the car, but this time let her sit in the passenger seat.
So he must have trusted me a little bit to not put me back in the boot to get more petrol. And we got to the pump, and I'm in the passenger seat. He gets out, fills up. He's watching me through the window, staring at me.
With the kidnapper keeping a watchful eye on his captive, Debbie would struggle yet again to make her escape.
So I just slowly I saw there was a man. The next pump on my left, there was a man, a taxi driver, at the next pump. And I thought, I can do this. I can do this. Slowly undid my seatbelt without looking at him.
She saw the opportunity to escape whilst he was filling the car up with petrol. He was using her money, and she ran, screaming and shouted.
I just ran for it to the taxi driver, sat on his knee. Just opened his door and sat on his knee.
Debbie's abductor did not pursue her.
He just calmly and casually got back into the car and just drove off as though nothing had happened.
That does actually tell us quite a lot about what's going on with him. So he seems to be quite emotionally divorced from what is going on. His language and his behaviour is very much that he's in control of this situation, but he doesn't seem to have any real fear of being caught. It does kind of suggest that this isn't some really bad psychotic episode. It's too controlled and he's too calm and going about his business as normal, almost.
Debbie had finally escaped her abductor after a horrific 11-hour ordeal. But it could have been even more terrifying if Debbie had known what had happened less than 24 hours earlier, just 5 miles away from where she was taken. Michael McGrath and his sister Rachel grew up in Wilmslow in Cheshire after the McGrath family moved there in 1970. Michael was 3 and Rachel was 5 months old.
Bright, lively, bubbly, beautiful, incredibly stubborn at times. But as my baby sister. She was an amazing pianist. It was lovely. So music was a life, really. She loved it. Really loved it.
Rachel McGrath was well educated. She was working for a building society as an assistant manager.
She was 27, got a good career ahead of her. She was a lovely girl who led life to the full. She was very much loved by her family.
Rachel had recently moved in with her boyfriend and they were settling down together.
He was very good for her and they were great as a couple. So it was great to see how happy she was.
On the evening of the 25th of April 1997, Rachel's boyfriend went out for a few drinks with friends to a pub in nearby Bramall. It was the same pub that 27-year-old Nicholas Burton had made his way to that evening.
Nicholas Burton, he was a bit of a loner. He'd left the house and he'd walked 10 miles to the pub in Bramall, where he'd been seen by numerous members of the pub, and he was prone to smoking cigars and drinking Guinness. And he was also going round the pub begging for money so that he could buy the items.
Burton attempted to interact with a number of different customers that were there that evening.
Numerous points he tried to engage in conversation with a group next to him. That was rebuffed. He made a rather lewd comment about what he was doing there, and he said, "Oh, I'm waiting to meet a beautiful woman." He clearly wasn't. He was clearly a loner on his own.
He seemed to be quite focused on a beautiful girl, and I just feel that maybe there were some strange thought processes going on then where he was definitely in the stages of planning some form of activity or action that was going to come later on. But he was obsessed with it, whatever it was, when he was just chatting in the pub.
At one point he begged money to go buy some cigars from the shop down the road and came back in.
While Rachel's boyfriend was also drinking in the same pub as Burton, Rachel had gone to visit her parents, and her brother Michael joined her there.
She was really buzzing that day because she'd been interviewed by the Daily Mail about her team at work, and there was a really lovely article where I left at about 7, And she turned around to me and said, "Don't forget Daily Mail, page 39. And it's ironic because only a few hours later she was all over the front page of pretty much all the nationals.
Rachel returned to the pub at closing time to collect her boyfriend and take him home. But while she was waiting outside in the car, a deadly monster was also in the car park, looking for someone to prey upon. On the evening of the 25th of April 1997, Nicholas Burton had been drinking in a pub in Bramall, Cheshire. The 27-year-old loner had spent the night begging for money and pestering other drinkers.
He was probably in the pub for about 4 hours. Penniless, no money. He had enough money on him to buy a single pint of Guinness, which apparently he sipped and made last that length of time.
It was closing time at the pub, and it was around 5 to 11 when he went outside for a smoke.
27-year-old Rachel McGrath's boyfriend had also been drinking in the same pub that evening, and after spending time with her parents and brother, Rachel drove to the pub to pick him up.
So she's waiting to collect him, pre-arranged meeting point by the rear door of the pub.
Unbeknown to Rachel, she wasn't alone in the car park. She was being watched.
He saw Rachel in the car, and he took the opportunity when he saw her there, parked up, doors unlocked in the passenger side, and he jumps in. She probably thought that was her boyfriend getting in.
What we think happened is that he got into the passenger door, held a knife to her, and was trying to abduct her.
Instead of driving away as the man had wanted her to, Rachel decided to get out of the car and try to escape instead.
She's no more than 30 feet, I would say, from the rear door of the pub. Goes out to the driver's door and trying to rush round to the pub entrance at the rear. And it's pretty clear that he goes round the other way and catches her at the rear of the car.
He's chased her and caught her virtually against the wall, and she's had no chance. Unfortunately, at that time, the pub was packed, but outside, everybody's having last orders, so we had no witnesses to what took place in the next period of time.
As Rachel tried to escape, the man chasing her pulled out a hunting knife that he'd been concealing and used it to stop her getting away.
Then he grabs her from behind. To incapacitate her, brings his knife up through the back of her right leg, so it comes out of the front. A second major incapacitation wound through her ribcage on the right-hand side that punctures her right lung.
The knifeman had brought defenseless Rachel to the ground with injuries that would have been agonizing for her. To stop Rachel from drawing attention to the attack from people nearby, the man then used the same knife he'd already horrifically wounded her with.
To stop her screaming, with a sawing action, hacks through her throat, severing her vocal cords and a carotid artery on the right-hand side, and actually nicking the back of her spine. With a knife that we know is about 23 centimetres long. Doesn't get any worse than that. The only thing that he didn't do was rape her. But he made a real mess of her. A real mess of her. It doesn't get any worse.
It would have been a slow death for over a few minutes. She was screaming, but there was nobody about to actually hear those screams.
The cowardly knife man then fled the scene, leaving Rachel dying alone on the cold ground outside the pub.
And that's horrible. You know, nobody nobody deserves that. And it showed you what a monster he was.
As revellers left the pub at closing time, Rachel's body was discovered. By then, it was too late to save her. Police quickly arrived at the crime scene.
The night detective, who was a DC, he absolutely did a fantastic job in sealing the pub off. so that nobody left. And we managed to get a brief chat before they were released from the pub.
Detective Sergeant Paul Moores from Greater Manchester Police remembers arriving at the chilling scene.
It's probably one of the worst set of injuries that I've ever witnessed in the whole of my career as a detective. I was on the major incident team, which covered all murders in Manchester for the last 7 years of my service.
This was incredibly brutal. This was a young woman on her own in what should have been a relatively safe area, and a completely random but targeted attack. I can see why that is shocking and deeply upsetting.
The victim had been waiting to collect her boyfriend to take him home, and this attack seemed to be entirely unprovoked.
We didn't have a clue as regards what the motive was and what the potential was of the particular offender. We still didn't know anything about him.
Nobody had seen the attack, and there was no CCTV to provide vital clues as to who had done this. Identifying the mystery killer wouldn't be a quick task.
Any forensic evidence at the scene wouldn't have been found until later. We all agreed that we'd got nothing at that stage, no evidence, and we needed a breakthrough.
While Detective Sergeant Moores took charge of the crime scene, other police officers had to break the devastating news about Rachel to her family.
We were awoken. I remember looking at the clock next to the bed. It was 2:45 a.m. We got a knock at the door, and immediately you're thinking, hang on a second, that's not good news. So I opened the door, and my parents were there with 2 policemen. So my mother was in tears, clearly, and her father was ashen-faced, and the police basically said, Michael, we need you to come with us now, please. So I got dressed and got to my parents' house about 3, and then they sat us down and said, your sister's been killed.
The family were unaware at that point of just how horrific the circumstances surrounding Rachel's death were.
My brain's going into overtime. You don't really know how to take that in. You're still trying to digest all that. My mother at that time was really struggling. She was not reacting very well to what had happened. We had to call the doctor to her to give her some sedatives.
By the morning, news of the murder had sent shockwaves through the local community and attracted national press.
So we got back to the house in Wilmslow, and then there's just a media scrum developing. We had, say, reporters outside the house that morning wanting to speak to my parents. I was keen to protect them. I managed to stop the newspapers arriving because the early pictures of in the newspapers had photographs of a tent where Rachel had been killed.
Rachel had been murdered around 11 p.m. the night before. The mystery killer had fled the scene and left her dying. Rachel's family had been informed, but the police had no further updates for them.
So the police sat down with us later that morning and said, we are starting from scratch with this. And at that stage, it's a murder. We don't understand what the motive is. We don't understand if there are any suspects. They're working way through the investigation. And it's clearly a manhunt. It's clearly a manhunt, but they've got nothing to go on.
When the police had arrived at the scene and interviewed customers still in the pub, a few of them mentioned that there'd been a new face in there that evening, a man drinking Guinness and smoking cigars.
And we managed to get the names and addresses of every single one of those people.
The identity of the customer was unknown, but even then there was nothing to suggest this mysterious man had anything to do with the murder. As Sunday evening came around with no further leads, Detective Paul Moores received a phone call. When 17-year-old Debbie had escaped in Wales, the police from where she went missing in Greater Manchester were informed.
And we put 2 and 2 together, and we didn't know at that stage that it was definitively linked. And I was briefed that I was going to go to North Wales, to Carnarvon, where Debbie had managed to escape, and progress the inquiry from there.
The police came, and I remember seeing Paul and thinking, I'm safe. I've got away, I've escaped. I was just in complete shock and relief that I got away.
We wanted to see whether there was a link to the murder, and there clearly was, because I remember this vividly, as though it was yesterday. Debbie said to me that he'd talked about smoking cigars and that he drank Guinness. And when that clicked into place, and with the inquiries that had been done with the occupants of the pub the previous night.
As the details started to fit together, police in the next town of Bangor had located Debbie's stolen car.
North Wales Police found Debbie's car abandoned, having been involved in a bit of a collision with a wall. So that activated even more inquiries.
The police immediately contacted all of the nearby hotels, trying to find the wanted man. And a staff member at one of the hotels soon gave Detective Sergeant Moores the news he'd been waiting to hear.
He was there. And as soon as it was mentioned by him about the cigars and the Guinness, I knew it was him. You know, my gut feeling had become an adrenaline-pumping situation. And I asked for a firearms team to go and make the arrest.
Armed police gathered in Bangor, Wales, ready to storm the hotel room, expecting to find Debbie's abductor on the other side of the door. There was even more at stake for Detective Sergeant Moores. He was hoping this raid would finally help him find Rachel's killer. In April 1997, 17-year-old Debbie had been abducted from her hometown of Gatley, Greater Manchester, and forced to drive at knife point to North Wales. Debbie had escaped, and the police had located where her kidnapper may be hiding. As they got ready to storm the hotel room, Detective Sergeant Paul Moores briefed them that this may also be the man responsible for killing 27-year-old Rachel McGrath in Bramall, Cheshire, just over 24 hours earlier.
And I emphasised the seriousness and the horrendous nature of the attack. And I made sure that they knew full well that the room was to be sealed off completely. And we got him. And that's when it all started to kick into place.
The man apprehended at the hotel was 27-year-old Nicholas Burton, the drug abuser who'd been drinking in the pub the night Rachel was killed. Items found in his hotel room gave the police even more to potentially link him to the murder.
They'd found bloodstains on the knife. They'd found bloodstains in the sink. There was some trainers that were drying that might be blood. And there was also a jacket in the wardrobe that had a stain on it, which could have been the blood stain, and turned out it was.
There are some similarities between his appearance and an individual who they believe was in the pub prior to my sister's murder.
Nicholas Burton had been caught with incriminating evidence. But if officers thought it would be an easy conviction, they were wrong.
He wouldn't speak to the police. He didn't speak when he was interviewed. No admissions. He wouldn't have any blood samples taken from him. He was not cooperating.
The results of the DNA analysis linked the knife found in Burton's hotel room to Rachel McGrath.
Once that came back, statistically, it was a 1 in 300 million chance of it not being Rachel's blood, so at that point you know it's him.
Burton was still not cooperating with the police, and they were unable to find a motive that linked him to the crimes. Despite Burton's silence, detectives were confident the evidence against him was strong. On the 30th of April 1997, they charged him with the abduction of Debbie. 2 days later, they charged him with Rachel's murder. To secure a conviction for murder, the police would have to prove that Burton had fully intended to kill.
But you've still got no sense of any motive, no reason. And as any rational human being, you're turning these things over in your mind and going, why has this happened?
Another element police would have to prove is that Burton was of sound mind at the time he committed the crimes. Just prior to the trial, Burton started to make some previously unmentioned claims.
He said he thought he was God and that the voices were telling him to do these things. You know, again, it shows a lot of premeditation.
There was no supporting evidence from the past, from his medical records, that he'd suffered from any kind of mental illness. I think that was just Burton cottoning on to an idea in an attempt to save his skin.
He never claimed this before, so the timing does become quite important.
The trial started at Liverpool Crown Court on the 23rd of March 1998, and Burton carried on using the same excuses as to why he'd acted the way he did.
He tried to plead not guilty on the grounds of diminished responsibility, and when that failed completely, he went down the lines of he was unfit through insanity.
Burton's attempts to argue he wasn't in the right frame of mind when he killed Rachel and abducted Debbie were quickly quashed by the professionals.
The prosecution called 2 psychiatrists who say there's absolutely no question of him being diminished responsibility. He knew exactly what he was doing.
We had the reports coming in from the psychiatrists saying he's the most dangerous man I've ever had to interview in my whole career, professional career.
That's quite a chilling assessment to come from 2 separate professionals who both saw that level of danger in him. So I think what they were saying in that is this was not an isolated incident. This is something that is part of who this man is, and that maybe he's going to continue to be a danger.
In my service, I've never heard a psychiatrist give such strong evidence that showed that he was actually sane, but he was a dangerous, dangerous man, and still is, in my opinion.
There was still the issue of proving that Burton had a motive, thereby showing for certain that it was a premeditated attack and that it was in fact murder rather than manslaughter.
We had a witness who was in prison, and he had been in the hospital wing with Burton, and a conversation had been taking place where Burton had suggested that he'd been reading a book which was based around SAS tactics, and that was the motive behind bringing down Rachel from a standing position after he'd hacked her throat.
He was bragging about what he'd done to make himself look the big man in prison, no doubt.
Provided a motive as to why he killed her in that way, and it also showed that he'd premeditated the murder. He knew what he was doing. He was calculated and manipulative with the way that he attacked her.
Detective Sergeant Paul Moores and the McGrath family were at the trial every day, and Debbie was able to come face to face with her abductor to watch him account for what he'd done to her.
He looked like a rat, all stooped, and he looked pathetic. He had the odd glance at us and just looked... He just didn't have any emotion. Yeah, just little, pathetic. Just didn't have any remorse, nothing.
Nicholas Burton took to the stand himself to give his account of what happened on those fateful days in April 1997. As his own barrister asked him questions, the courtroom watched on in disbelief.
I remember I was shaking. My legs were shaking when he came out with this answer, when he could have dropped a pin in the courtroom. It was that silent. He was asked the question, "What were you going to do to Debbie?"
He said he wanted to rape me and kill me. I knew that was his intention, but to actually hear the words was too much to hear. And in front of all those people, it's just more real. Hearing the words matter of fact, no emotion whatsoever. It was just evil.
It was a dramatic moment in the trial, but it was It was really chilling, and something I'll never forget.
It was deadly silent for a few seconds, and then poor Debbie, she realised what he'd said and the impact it had on her, and she ran out of court in tears. Three at least members of the jury burst into tears. One of my officers, he burst into tears. So I had to physically take him away and say, look, we've got to be professional here.
Burton shocked the court further by saying he would then have looked for a third victim. After a 2-week trial, the jury went out to deliberate whether Nicholas Burton was guilty or whether he didn't have the mental capacity to commit murder.
There were 4 counts. The first was Rachel's murder. The second was the abduction of Debbie. The third one was the false imprisonment of Debbie. And the fourth one was threats to kill her.
It was guilty on all 4 counts, and it was unanimous. So all 12 members of that jury all believed he was guilty based on the evidence.
Nicholas Burton received 3 life sentences for the murder of Rachel, the abduction of Debbie, and the false imprisonment of Debbie. The judge also handed Burton an additional 10 years for threats to kill Debbie.
He ended by saying, I shall recommend to the Home Secretary that you're never released.
The judge had reassured the court that Burton would never walk the streets again. 25 years later, and due to changes in the law that removed that power from the Home Secretary and passed it to parole boards, a shocking twist came about.
So we received a phone call from our victim liaison officer on the 3rd of March 2021. They said to us that Burton was eligible for parole, potentially as soon as May that year. We heard the trial judge make it very clear that the recommendation to the Home Secretary was that Burton should never be released. There's got to be some mistake here, there's got to be some error.
Debbie, now in her 40s, also received a phone call to tell her that Burton was up for parole.
We left the court that day knowing he's never coming out, thinking that's it for life. So it's just complete shock. And something has gone wrong.
If he gets parole and he's back out on the streets, no doubt in my mind, is a good chance that he could commit further offences and upset a lot of lives as a result again.
Rachel's family and Debbie are campaigning to prevent Burton's parole, to ensure that he stays behind bars forever.
We just don't want people like this walking the streets again.
He needs to be locked up for the rest of his life. The risk is too much, it's too high for him to be released.
I don't think he's ever going to change. I think this is part of his personality rather than it being a temporary and contained psychotic episode, for example.
The nature of Rachel's brutal murder impacted even seasoned police officers during the case.
In all my service, 32 years, I've never, ever experienced something as horrific as the circumstances surrounding that case. There's not a day goes by where I don't think about this case. It's the worst one I've ever been involved in.
And Nicholas Burton's actions on the 25th and 26th of April 1997 have had lifelong effects for Rachel's family.
My father's a broken man. My mother's never recovered. I don't know any mother who would. So he destroyed my parents. He destroyed my parents.
And for Debbie, she'll forever live with the trauma of what happened to her.
I never really processed it properly. I just found it too painful to talk about. Thinking that I spent 11 hours with this monster and what he could have done to me and what he did to Rachel. It's like something out of a horror film. Who does those things? It's just evil. Just a monster. Just inhumane.
Nicholas Burton was a loner and a drug addict who went out with the intention to rape and murder innocent strangers. Psychiatrists agreed he was the most dangerous man they'd met, and the sentencing judge advised that he should never be allowed to walk the streets again. Nicholas Burton will forever be known as one of Britain's most evil killers.
You wouldn't expect a spiritualist minister to lie, have affairs, or borrow thousands of pounds and never return it. But even if he did all that, would he go so far as to kill? Killer in My Village, available now, new on Sky Crime.
During a cruel New York winter, a beloved woman vanishes without a trace.
I knew something wasn't right, because it wasn't like her.
Being outside in below freezing temperatures for an extensive time can be deadly.
Investigators soon find multiple factors at play in her life.
The police knew this was not a marriage made in heaven.
She did have a boyfriend on the side.
She had just fired someone who threatened her.
There was more to this than met the eye.
And when detectives make a gruesome discovery, it's the weather that becomes their ace in the hole.
We wouldn't have had the evidence that we had it not been for the cold February weather here.
I didn't know cold weather could do that.
On the edge of the Hudson River, just north of the New York state capital of Albany, sits the city of Watervliet.
Watervliet is an average small American city where most people, they know each other, and the people that live there generally stay there since Albany's nearby and there's a lot of opportunity for work.
They're good people that live there. There's a lot of two-family houses. The owner lives on the first floor and they rent the second floor.
The area can experience all 4 seasons, but winters can be extra long, averaging below freezing temperatures and more than 50 inches of snow.
No doubt about it, this is a cold area of the country, and we do get blizzards and nor'easters in the winter.
Nor'easters are named for the northeasterly direction the winds come from, and they typically travel up the coast. They're extremely powerful storms that can bring gale force winds, and in the winter, they can dump several inches of snow.
Of course, you can get a lot more. You can get up to 3 feet dumped on you at one storm.
Every year it's different. You don't know how much snow you're going to get.
So it's no surprise when on February 2nd, 1986, 6 inches of snow fell, adding to the 4 inches already on the ground.
With temperatures rarely above 30 the entire month, the snow continued to accumulate with very little melting.
And it's this cold, snowy weather that will end up becoming a star in the biggest criminal investigation the area has ever seen. As locals wake to another snowy morning with freezing temperatures, the Watervliet police get a panic call from a man named Donald Bent.
He says his 47-year-old wife, Joan Bent, went to work the night before and then just never came home.
Joan Bent was born Joan Carol Donlin on November 29, 1938, in Cohoes, Albany County, New York.
The Donlins were a small family. It was just Joan and her brother Eugene, and they moved to Watervliet, and that's where Joan graduated from high school.
Joan grew to be a very sweet and kind young woman.
She cared about everybody, and she would do anything for anybody if she could do it. She just had a heart of gold.
In 1957, Joan married, and they had 2 daughters together.
She was a loving mother, and she had a bit of an outgoing personality.
She was also very smart and completely independent. So when the marriage didn't work out, Joan had no problem taking care of herself.
After her divorce, with her children grown, Joan started a new life. She began working at a motel and even bought a house in Watervliet, about 3 miles south.
Joan Bent worked as a supervisor for the cleaning staff at a motel in the city of Albany. She also kept track of their time cards and did their payroll. They loved her. She was a great boss and treated everyone with respect.
She was very soft-spoken, never heard her raise her voice. She was just a very nice lady. She really was a sweet lady.
But Joan took her job very seriously.
She was very reliable, a hardworking person who was dedicated to her job, dedicated to her career.
There was many times when she would stay late to do payroll or do a schedule or something to that effect.
She was also just as meticulous with her appearance.
Joan was known to like to dress up. She liked makeup and jewelry and nice clothes.
Joan was very neat and very organized, and she liked to look that way too. She always looked put together and completely in control.
Joan soon found herself in a new relationship with Donald Bent, a self-employed electrician 6 years her senior.
The couple times I had seen him in passing, he was well-mannered, very polite.
Donald was also divorced, and he had an adult daughter who was living on her own, so they quickly were able to bond over that.
In 1983, the two married, and Donald moved into Joan's house. Everything appeared to be going well, as Joan and Donald made a life for themselves. Until a cold and snowy February 16th, when Joan mysteriously disappears. Police go to the house to talk to Donald and see if they can find anything that might point to her whereabouts. According to her husband, Joan works at a motel where she is the manager of housekeeping and came home around 4 p.m. the day before.
He said they had pot roast and potatoes for dinner, and they ate around 4:30 and had a nice meal together with nice conversations.
And then she made cookies, and then they watched the ABC Sunday night movie. Then he said that she decided to go to work at around 11 o'clock.
She told him she was going back to her job because she had to finish the payroll.
Which he said was not unusual, but she didn't come home that night along with her vehicle.
He says he started to worry and made several calls to the motel and friends to see if anyone had seen her, and no one had. He tells police that when she still hadn't returned by morning, that's when he called the police.
Donald admits, although they were heading down the path to divorce, it just wasn't like her to vanish with no word.
According to Donald, they were having a friendly divorce from their marriage of 3.5 years.
Could Joan have just decided to leave him? The quick check of their home shows that's unlikely.
In terms of her packing up a suitcase, taking her clothes, taking her toothbrush, her belongings, a search of the house did not reveal any of that.
No woman leaves her makeup behind, or her favorite clothes, or her shoes.
Police wonder if she got in an accident because of the snowy conditions.
The first thing police do is they put a bolo out for her car and her plates. It could have started snowing that night, no question. She could have run off the road. Roads can be slippery in February.
Watervliet police check all the hospitals and notify the State Bureau of Criminal Investigations.
Watervliet Police Department would commonly call us for any major case because we had a lot more resources, including investigators and forensics. So I was assigned to help work on the missing person case of Joan Bent.
Detective Horton begins by speaking to Joan and Donald's neighbors, even though the weather isn't making it easy.
The weather was extremely cold, with temperatures in the teens, and it was windy, which makes it feel even colder.
You're cold all over, and a lot of people don't invite you into their home. So I'm doing interviews on a front porch. You may be outside for 8-10 hours, going door to door.
But the time spent in the frigid winter air doesn't give detectives much to go on.
People would just say they're very quiet, they seem like a good couple, she's lovely, we've never had a problem with her. So nothing revealing became of that.
As the search for Joan gets underway, could the cold, blustery winter be the key to finding out what happened to her?
No one had a clue how important the weather would turn out to be in this case.
That was one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle.
On a freezing winter morning in the small city of Watervliet in upstate New York, 47-year-old Joan Bent is reported missing by her 53-year-old husband, Donald.
Donald Bent said that they had dinner together the previous Sunday night. He had prepared pot roast, and then she made cookies.
They watched a movie, and then according to Donald, he said that she decided to go to work at the motel around 11 o'clock, but she never showed up.
There were a lot of possibilities. You know, the possibility she got into a wreck on a slippery road.
There were below freezing temperatures, ice and snow and winds. These elements can all make travel very dangerous.
But so far, there is no sign of Joan or her car. State and local investigators go to the motel where Joan was reportedly heading the night before. Investigator Horton speaks to those who work closely with Joan. He learns that Joan had been there earlier on Sunday.
There was time slots where she had to show that she had been there and when she had left.
She had signed in for the keys to the housekeeping office at 9:30 a.m. that day and then signed them out at 3:45 p.m. But she hadn't been back on Sunday night.
All the women she worked with thought this was odd.
Payroll hadn't been done from the night before, which was her normal routine. She'd go in on a Sunday after hours and she would do payroll. I knew right away something was wrong when payroll wasn't done.
Her employer had nothing but good things to say about her. This was highly unusual for her to just disappear without letting anyone know.
Investigators ask if they know of anyone who would want to hurt Joan, but most say she didn't have any enemies, except maybe one.
There was one girl that we worked with that wasn't crazy for her.
She had to let one of the women that worked for her go because she found her sleeping in one of the beds instead of cleaning the room.
She wasn't a very good maid. She had gotten a few write-ups over it and a few warnings over it, and finally Joan said, "I have to let you go." And she let her go, but they had words. She said, "I'll get you for this. You'll pay for this."
She was angry and knocked some stuff off of Joan's desk. The other women that worked with her knew about the threat.
So at first, we kind of thought maybe they got into it.
But as Detective Horton interviews more of the women who worked with Joan, a new picture of her life emerges.
They knew Joan better than her husband did. They saw Joan every day, and Joan shared with them personal stuff.
It was no secret with Joan's friends and fellow employees that her marriage was not going well.
They were always arguing about money because he didn't carry his share. She did. It was her house. She was trying to pay the mortgage every month. He supposedly was an electrician, but he didn't apparently work hard to find clients. He preferred to sit at home all day, drink coffee, and watch television.
On top of that, the couple had a large amount of debt.
Donald had been arrested the previous year for embezzlement of $31,000 in his place of business. So there was some tension in the household because he was ordered to pay restitution. I'm sure that didn't help the marriage.
They say that Don decided to build an addition onto the house to bring in cash.
They should take that bedroom, expand on it somehow, and turn it into a small apartment. And he told Joan that he would get the guy down the street, a neighbor that he was friends with, to help do the work.
Her friends say Joan agreed to fund it, but then quickly regretted it.
It became a disaster. It took forever. The house was a mess, and Joan loved that house to be neat as can be, and it wasn't the case.
Not only was construction a mess, but Joan did not like the neighbor who was supposed to be helping her husband. He was always just kind of inappropriate with her.
The guy was always flirting with her. Not only creepy, but I think brushing up against her.
The women she worked with tried to be supportive.
I just said to her, I don't know why you're still there. Tell him to get out. She said it's easier said than done.
To police, this all sounds very different than the way Don described their marriage.
You could see that the relationship was not as rosy as Donald portrayed it to be.
But as investigator Horton learns more about Joan's personal life, he discovers that Don wasn't the only man in her life. Joan was seeing someone named Ed Zimmer.
So right there, that's a red flag for us.
They had known each other for quite a few years, and they were good friends. But they just started seeing each other in restaurants, going to dinner, talking. He wanted something more, but she was still married to Donald, so she wasn't going to pursue anything until the marriage was over.
Joan appeared to be a very loyal person, not only to her job, her friends, but to her husband. And I think she was in a tight spot here.
Investigators fear foul play may be involved.
Right off the get-go, this is suspicious. And as the hours passed, it became more evident that there was more to this than met the eye in terms of her just taking off on her own volition, and that she probably didn't.
Just days into their investigation, police have multiple persons of interest in Joan Bent's disappearance as her husband pleads with the public for help.
She is my entire life.
In the below freezing temperatures and constant snow of February 1986, police in upstate New York are searching for Joan Bent, who has been missing for several days.
She's made contact with nobody. She hasn't shown up for work. As the days progress, especially with the cold weather, chances are she's not going to be found alive.
After speaking with her friends and co-workers at the motel where she manages housekeeping, investigators now have multiple persons of interest.
There's the maid she fired who threatened her, the creepy guy helping build the addition to her house, and she even had a boyfriend, so there's a lot of potential suspects.
But first, they circle back to her husband, Donald, who reported her missing and was the last to see her.
We found contradictions in his story.
Cops always look at the spouse first, especially in the case of a wife. They look at the husband.
Six days after Joan went missing, state investigators make their way through the snow and icy temperatures to the Bent home and speak with Donald.
But Donald isn't fazed by what Joan's staff has said, and he admits that they did go through some tough times for a while.
But he is adamant that he and Joan were getting along fine.
He said they ate dinner together that Sunday around 5 o'clock when she came home from work. It was a pot roast dinner that he made for her, and then she made cookies and they watched a movie. Everything was fine. He said about 11 o'clock she left.
She did a lot of Sunday nights. She would come in after hours after the girls had left for the day, and she would do the payroll and the schedules for the following week and stuff like that.
But when the police went to her job and talked to the women who worked for Joan, They said, no, she never came back Sunday night.
Could something have happened to Joan on her way to work?
There's always the possibility that she got out of her car at work and somebody grabbed her. And if she had stopped at a convenience store or something and got abducted, but as far as we know, she never made it to work.
They asked Don, did your wife have any enemies? He said no. That was not ever a possibility. She led kind of a quiet life.
Because some of his statements have been inconsistent with what her staff said, police asked Donald if he's willing to take a polygraph, and he agrees to help in any way he can.
And he was found to be inconclusive, and he did talk to us freely. He was interviewed at least 3 or 4 times. He kept to his story.
Donald even goes on the news, pleading for help in finding his wife.
Donald was crying all over the TV, and I'm sure people felt bad, and I'm sure people wondered, where is this woman?
She is my entire life.
But with no evidence linking Donald to Joan's disappearance, detectives turn their focus on the other people in Joan's life who may have had a motive to hurt her.
We did discover through interviews that one particular employee had made threats against Joan because she was fired.
Police track her down and interview her, and she doesn't deny the situation.
She said, yes, I did threaten Joan. She said I was upset, I lost my job, but it was deemed that she had nothing to do with Joan's disappearance. So you kind of check that box and move on to the next.
They questioned the creepy neighbor who was helping Donald with the addition to the house.
And he didn't have any information about Joan's disappearance. In fact, he says he was married and his wife was expecting a baby.
He told the cops he was at their baby shower all day, and there was a couple dozen people who could verify his alibi.
This leaves investigators with one person left to talk to, Joan's boyfriend, Ed Zimmer.
There was that possibility that she met the boyfriend and then they took off.
As detectives continue to follow leads in Joan Bent's disappearance, the winter weather uncovers something that completely changes the direction of the investigation.
This is a huge lead. This is the biggest lead we've had in 11 days.
During a frigid, snowy winter, state and local police in Watervliet, New York, are about to discover a big piece of the puzzle in the mysterious disappearance of 47-year-old Joan Bent.
You get frustrated as time goes on. You're waiting for that one phone call to say, we found the car, we found Joan.
Detectives were starting to suspect foul play, but there was still the chance that she ran off with her boyfriend.
Detectives look into Ed Zimmer's background and find no criminal record. In fact, they find he works for the State Division of Criminal Justice Services.
They found Ed, the boyfriend. He was still in town. He hadn't taken off. She wasn't with him.
Ed says the night Joan disappeared, he was home alone watching TV.
He says the last time he saw her was on Valentine's Day when they exchanged gifts, which was 2 days before she disappeared.
We interviewed him at length, and we found nothing new in terms of him knowing where she was. However, he did corroborate everything that everyone else was saying.
She would confide in him about the marriage. He wanted her to divorce Donald.
And I think the police decided he was a pretty decent guy and loved Joan.
Which means detectives are back to square one.
We're into 9, 10, 11 days. You're saying, what are we missing here?
They're about to find out. "11 days after Joan's disappearance, police get a surprising call from a maintenance worker at a hotel in the village of Menands, 3 miles south of Watervliet.
There's a suspicious car in their parking lot. It's been there for at least a week.
He was out shoveling snow all week and just kept seeing that car sitting there, never moving.
He looked in the car and he saw there were keys in the ignition and a woman's purse on the seat. And that's when he thought, no, this isn't good. That's when he called Waterville Lead Police.
A team of state and local investigators arrived to examine the car.
And sure enough, there was Joan's car. The car was parked in sort of an obscure, out-of-sight area of the parking lot. We've got a break. We've got our crime scene. This car is part of a crime scene now. This is a huge lead. This is the biggest lead we've had in 11 days.
Detectives call in the forensics team before touching the car.
And we let them open up the doors of the car. Inside of the car was unremarkable.
It was after that that the forensic guys opened up the trunk.
And that's when everything changes.
I remember standing there in the parking lot freezing, and lo and behold, there was Joan, obviously deceased. Unfortunately, she was frozen solid because of the weather.
It was an average of 25 degrees those 11 days. It was just bitter cold. Everything freezes at that temperature.
Which will make the time of death difficult to determine and figure out how long she's actually been there.
And the winter weather could also potentially hurt their crime scene.
Snow was in the forecast, so you're up against time and weather. We tried to process the car and Joan's body as quickly as possible.
As they examine Joan's body, they can tell she's wearing the same clothes Donald said she wore when he last saw her.
And she also had a scarf around her neck, but no coat, which is odd in this kind of winter weather.
But her body being frozen is actually helpful to the investigation.
There was no decomposition at all, so they could identify her immediately, but they could also tell a potential cause of death.
They saw red marks on her neck, which would lead you to believe that she was strangled. I felt bad for her and her friends and her family.
The coroner removes Joan's body for an autopsy as police move the car to a more secure location, out of the weather.
The car was flatbedded back to State Police Headquarters. The forensic unit will go through the car inch by inch.
While examining the car, investigators rule out robbery as a motive, since Joan's purse was untouched and her car wasn't taken. They also notice that someone other than Joan must have driven the car last, someone tall.
They noticed that the driver's seat was really far back from the steering wheel. Now, Joan Bent is only 5'2".
It didn't appear that Joan had driven herself to that final resting spot in the parking lot of the hotel. It's circumstantial evidence, of course, but it really points towards someone who's 6 foot tall.
But more curious is what they find in the glove compartment.
The forensic team found some scripted notes with codes on them, not readily understandable.
The notes are sent to the lab for fingerprinting and decoding, while detectives deliver the sad news to Donald.
Donald sat on the couch, put his head in his hands, and just weeps openly. He's beside himself with grief, but by now, he's also lawyered up.
We did talk to him briefly, whereas nothing was learned. His lawyer got involved, and there was really nothing to gain from talking to him then.
He repeats the same story he's been telling police all along, but not everyone believes him.
We obviously knew he was 6 foot tall, and all the background we did on the marriage. Personally, I was leaning way towards Donald. With that being said, you never close the door on anyone else. You keep an open mind. You don't get tunnel vision.
Meanwhile, the medical examiner waits patiently to perform the autopsy.
Obviously, she was frozen, and I mean frozen solid.
When a body is frozen, you don't put heating lamps on it. You have to preserve whatever evidence there is for an autopsy. So you have to let it sit in a room with a regular temperature.
But detectives do learn that Joan isn't fully dressed.
She had on a shirt and a skirt, but strangely, she wasn't wearing stockings or a bra or underwear.
which was somewhat unusual because she always dressed meticulously according to her coworkers.
So detectives weren't sure if this was a sexually motivated crime or something completely different.
Some of the investigators thought this could lead back to her boyfriend.
Backing up the theory, investigators cracked the code on the written note.
We learned that these cryptic notes inside the car were from the man that Joan was seeing on the side.
He gave her these little notes written in code, like he would write, "I love you, 1, 4, 3.
Maybe they had a tryst and she ended up getting killed and was dressed quickly and didn't put on her bra and underpants.
Police decide it's time to speak with him again. Investigators continue to dig into the stories of both Joan's husband and her boyfriend as the winter weather points them in the right direction in the most unusual way.
As they say, dead bodies do talk and they can give you a lot of facts, and this was no exception to the rule.
"11 days after Joan Bent is reported missing in Watervliet, New York, her frozen body is found in the trunk of her car at a hotel.
I got the phone call 1 o'clock in the morning at my apartment that they had found the car and she was in the trunk. I was devastated, and I didn't know cold weather could do that. How are they going to find out who did this to her?
While they wait for an autopsy, local and state police look at her husband Donald Bent and her boyfriend Ed Zimmer as possible suspects, since neither have a solid alibi for the night she vanished.
Donald kept saying that she went back to work around 11 p.m. that night after a pot roast dinner, and her boyfriend said he was home alone watching TV.
We circled back to the man that Joan was seeing on the side because we learned that these cryptic notes inside the car were from this man.
Investigators question Ed Zimmer again and give him the sad news. He is genuinely distraught when he learns that Joan was murdered.
Ed admits that he wrote the notes, but he denies having anything to do with her death. He says it was just part of her Valentine's Day present.
But investigators do learn something new from him.
People remember things after the fact, especially when they're hit with a bombshell like this.
She told him she had gone to a lawyer. He never thought she was going to leave Donald, but she did decide to.
They had given Joan some money to help her make ends meet. She was trying to hire a lawyer for the divorce proceedings. Of course, he wanted her out of the marriage sooner rather than later and was falling in love with her. So anything he could do to help that along, he did.
He was the only one she could have turned to for a loan, for an attorney fee.
Could Donald have found out? But with no evidence and no eyewitnesses, police need more.
You have to prove your case. You have to make your case.
They're hoping the autopsy will reveal some clues. Two days after Joan's body is found, it has finally thawed, and the medical examiner is able to perform the autopsy. He confirms that Joan was strangled.
It was later determined at the autopsy that Joan was strangled with some sort of ligature. With a ligature, it's a constant equal pressure around the neck.
They found a scarf in the trunk along with Joan's body, and they believe that the scarf was the murder weapon.
It was more of a silky type scarf. The forensic team was able to laser the scarf and actually found Don's fingerprints on this scarf, which does not prove much of anything because he could have touched the scarf when it was in the house.
The medical examiner finds no sign of sexual assault, but they do discover something that leaves everyone speechless.
The medical examiner opened up her stomach, and lo and behold, I was standing right there and saw, and my eyes could not believe, a pot roast dinner.
The pieces of pot roast in her stomach were still whole, almost unchewed, and one potato still had the marks of the serrated knife on it.
Thanks to the extremely frigid New York winter, her stomach contents froze as well.
Not only was it frozen, but it was frozen in time. Now, normally, if you eat anything, it goes through your system within 6 hours, your stomach is empty. And upon death, that digestion stops.
The medical examiner determines that Joan must have died within minutes after she ate dinner.
This woman is only short time before death.
The biggest tell was that potato, because they're so soft they start breaking down immediately in the digestive system. And this one was still whole.
All of those stomach contents stayed intact, which meant her last meal had not been digested, which meant she never left that house.
Now, according to Don, he thought they ate dinner around 5 p.m. 5 to 11 is 6 hours. If she left for work, like he said, at 11, her stomach should have been empty. Whereas it was not. He was lying.
Investigators are now certain that Donald Bent is responsible for his wife's death.
The biggest break in this case, other than finding her body, was finding her stomach contents, which blew his story right out of the water.
But is it enough for an arrest? The cold, snowy February weather in upstate New York helped police in their investigation in the case of Joan Bent.
Because the weather froze her body, they were able to, 1, tell that it was her, and 2, tell how she died.
But it was those stomach contents that just did it, and it was because of the weather. I don't know what would have happened to her body if it was July.
If it had been the summertime, after 11 days in the trunk of a car, not only would her body have decomposed, but their stomach contents would have as well.
With no confession or eyewitness, detectives spend the next year building their case.
You want to arrest when the time is right. You want it to stick. We crossed every T and dotted every I, and all things led back to Donald.
Finally, on April 30th, 1987, 14 months after Joan was reported missing, Donald Bent is arrested for the second-degree murder of his wife.
When he was arrested, he made no effort to resist physically or hide or anything like that.
I was very relieved that they finally got him.
As he sits in an Albany County jail cell, the state prepares for an entirely circumstantial case. But even though investigators are certain of Donald's guilt, will a jury be convinced?
I had never, ever, ever seen stomach contents as the prime evidence in a murder trial.
On April 4th, 1988, Donald Bent goes on trial for the second-degree murder of his wife. He pleads not guilty.
The district attorney had to paint a picture for the jury.
He says that Bent had the opportunity, motive, and means to kill his wife. They believe that on February 16, 1986, when Joan came home from work, over dinner she told Donald it was over.
She had apparently gone to a lawyer, and he knew it. I think she told him. It was her house. She told him he better start looking for some place to live.
They probably got into an argument, and it had to do with money. It had to do with she wanted the marriage to end. It had to do with him not working, all of that.
They say Don was fearful that a divorce would leave him virtually penniless and unable to meet his obligation to pay restitution for his embezzlement, which could also mean jail time.
He was going to lose half of whatever he had, and he didn't have much because of his previous arrest and conviction, and he was ordered to pay restitution of $31,000, which he didn't have.
So he was going to be out with no one bringing in money and no house and television to sit in front of all day long. All of those things just built up, and he just snapped.
After dinner, Joan went to the bedroom to change her clothes, and Don followed her.
The theory is that he came up behind her, grabbed that scarf, and he pulled it around her neck, and he strangled her.
Donald killed her, then tried to dress her as best he could, and couldn't take the time or wherewithal to put underwear and a bra on her.
Then he put her body in the trunk of her car, and he drove it a mile down the road, and he parked the car, and then he walked home.
Prosecutors argue that he left the keys in the ignition and her purse on the front seat, hoping that someone would steal the vehicle and thus draw attention away from him.
Waited a day or two and then cried to the Waterville police that his wife had gone missing.
He really used the media to try to make himself look like the concerned husband.
But he can't lie his way around her frozen stomach contents that prove she was dead before he claimed she had even left the house.
He's the only one who could have done it. He was in the house with her after she finished eating.
But the defense tries to show that something happened to her after she left the house, and all the evidence is circumstantial. The prosecution's case rests on a plethora of circumstantial evidence.
Our evidence consisted of the car seat, the scarf, financial difficulties, which leads to part of the marriage being on the rocks, that Donald lied about Sunday night in terms of her going to work at 11 o'clock based on her stomach contents.
The forensics expert's testimony was just incontrovertible. I mean, there was simply nothing the defense had that could take away from the fact that she was murdered within minutes of eating.
On May 3rd, 1988, after 5 weeks of testimony, Donald Bent is convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison.
I was happy. I was happy that he was convicted because I truly believed he was guilty.
In 2018, Donald Bent was paroled. He died in a nursing home 2 years later, at the age of 87. With the conclusion of the mysterious murder case of Joan Bent, there's no mistaking that she will forever be missed.
She didn't deserve to die the way she died. No one deserves that. I miss her today as much as I missed her then. And I always will.
Luckily, the killer didn't take the weather into consideration.
No way would he think that the pot roast was going to do him in because of the cold weather.
The weather was actually a huge factor. It led to his conviction.